God, thank you for this day, and God, as we look at a challenging but important section of the Old Testament tonight, we would be able to learn from it, and maybe answer questions, and see what you have in store for us tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so today we are going to probably not get through the whole notes because I realized I have 2 weeks to do Judges, so I'll probably finish that, but I also forgot to add some stuff on possibility of genocide. What do we do with this genocide stuff in the Old Testament? So you may have to add some notes, or I'll put it on the next batch next week as well, and write all this stuff down. But essentially, one of the big questions when you get to the book of Joshua is different groups will say, man, it doesn't sound very nice that God told everyone, the Israelites, to go in and destroy all these people. The atheists jump on it and go, oh yeah, see, your God is evil and mean and he wants to kill everyone and do all that kind of stuff. Some of their quotes are pretty gnarly when it comes to this section of the Bible. The Islamic people, they say, oh, see, you guys can't get mad about us for jihad because your God commanded jihad in the Old Testament. That's one of their go-to arguments, essentially. And then millennials and people of our age, although me and Natalie don't consider ourselves millennials, even though we fit squarely in that in that category. We watch TV and do stuff that other millennials apparently don't, so we're like, we have cable and that kind of thing. But they go, I don't like the God of the Old Testament. I only want to follow the God of the New Testament. You know, Andy Stanley came out and said that a couple of months ago, and some different people. So there are some valid apologetic reasons, I guess, if you will, for why there's a whole book that a guy, I think he's at Houston Baptist now, Paul Copan, he wrote a book. The whole book is, Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament? That's the title of the book. And it's a real good book. We had to read it for one of my classes. And he goes through a lot of different arguments, but I summarize a couple of them. One, it's not really genocide in that sense, because in Genesis 15, and I pointed this out when we got to Genesis 15 with Abraham, God tells Abraham 400 years in advance in Genesis 15, verse 16, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, speaking of the Israelites, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So he's basically saying that the Israelites coming and conquering the Canaanites in the book of Joshua is divine judgment, that God gave them 400 years to repent, and they didn't repent, so God sends the Israelites in as kind of his divine judgment. You might say, well, that doesn't seem very fair, but when the Israelites sin and they have all kinds of problems, God uses the Babylonians to come in and do pretty much the same exact thing to them. So it's not that God is playing favorites or picking and choosing. When his own people do the same thing, he does that as well. Second, we'll see today that not all the Canaanites get killed. Some of them convert to Judaism. Rahab converts to Judaism. She's the one in the story of Jericho. We'll get to her. She not only converts to Judaism, she's in the line of Christ. And Matthew tells us that. And so she becomes a thing. There's some people called the Gibeonites. They become worshipers of God. And so you had a choice. It wasn't like everyone got destroyed. If you converted, you were not had to deal with that. Third, it's not always how they did it. You know, this is mainly for the Islamic argument. They say, oh, well, you guys had jihad. Well, this was a specific occurrence. The Israelites didn't always fight like this. In the Old Testament law, they were commanded, if someone takes a prisoner, if someone is defeated, don't kill them, take them prisoner, you know, give them rights and things that the ancient world didn't allow for the most part. So this was a specific occurrence. They also have the problem of hyperbolic language. This is the idea of, it'll say something like, and the Israelites went in and destroyed all the men, all the women, and all the children. And you go, well, that sounds really, really harsh. but it's kind of how we would say the equivalent in the ancient world of like, you know, if you said, oh, that team in the football game killed the other team. Now, they didn't really kill the other team, I would hope not, or they'd all be in jail or something, but it's kind of an exaggerated language of they went in and just beat the living snot out of them or something like that, beat them 50-0 or something like that. We know that they don't go in and wipe everyone out because there's still people living in the land after this. It'll say they went and destroyed this town, but then like 2 chapters later, they'll be interacting with that town and talking to people from that town and that kind of thing. So they don't go in and destroy everyone. Also, the Canaanites, you know, sometimes the atheists really like to jump on this and they say, oh, God commanded that they slaughter all these innocent people. Well, the Bible makes it very clear that these are not innocent people. They were doing all kinds of immoral stuff. The Canaanites were known for human sacrifice, for child sacrifice, for cultic prostitution, for slavery, and all kinds of stuff that today we would say, yeah, those people deserve to be judged and do these kind of things. And so they're not innocent people in this. God just said, oh yeah, just wipe them out. They were being divinely judged for their sin. And finally, it's not universal in the sense that this is not how God usually acts. This was for a specific time, and it's not like God told the Israelites to kill the Canaanites, so that means I can kill my roommate if he annoys me or something like that, or I can go and do this. It's not. It was for a specific time and purpose and reason. It wasn't allowing for murder or anything like that. It was specifically for this reason to drive them out of the land. So that's a couple of reasons why we get to do that. And I can go into more detail on that when we get to Judges, and we'll see some of the people that supposedly were destroyed but yet are still there to show you some of that. So, but when we get to Joshua, Joshua is kind of the next 2 books we'll say are kind of guidebooks, rough, tough books, a lot of blood and guts and war, and then we get to Ruth, and it's like a nice love story to kind of even things out. But it's Joshua's not quite as bad as Judges. When we get to Judges next week, there's a lot of tough, really tough stories in Judges that we'll have to hit on. But Joshua, the theme is total victory, and the picture of Christ as commander of the Lord. And we'll see him when he asks for his battle plan, so to speak. So the author, we presume that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. Maybe he didn't write everything, because at the end it's kind of like Deuteronomy. At the end of the thing it says, and Joshua died. Probably didn't write that. Probably didn't go, and then I died. And then, that was probably added on by somebody later. But it almost seems like this is kind of Joshua's diary of what happens, or his battle reports, or something like that. Because it tells the story of, and then we went at it's not written in the first person, but it's like, and they went and fought this guy, and this is the military campaign, and these kind of, it's almost like a battle report that they compiled together to form the book of Joshua, written around 1400 BC, 1390. It's going to take them anywhere between 10 and 30 years to conquer the land. You may say that's a big gap in there, but it doesn't say timing. It just says, well, they went and defeated this army, and then they went and defeated this army, and they did this. And there's not really any numerical standard that we can use. So most people say between either 5 to 15 years or 10 to 30 years. Remember, they don't have advanced military weapons. Our fights today go pretty quick, because it's like you either blow somebody up with your tank, or you drop a bomb on them, or you do something like that, and the battle's over. Ancient world, they're using swords and bows and all that kind of stuff. It took a long time to complete some of these things. So, but they're fighting there. It's in the land, and they're preparing them to be a nation. They're out in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're finally going to get into the promised land and finally get the land that God promised to them in Abraham, which by now, Abraham's like 600 years ago. Because if you count when God first makes the promise to Abraham and the rest of his life, and then the rest of Isaac's life, and Jacob's life, and Joseph's life, and then the 400 years they're in captivity, it's in like 600 years now since God has made this promise. So that's like, what happened in 14? It's like the time of Columbus, essentially, from then to now, basically, is how long ago this is. Columbus, what, 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue? That's the only way I can remember. But so that's like about 600 years ago or so. So they are having to do this. So the first thing they do, that before they go in to conquer the land, it's almost like God prepares them in advance and is like, this is going to be tough. You guys, this is going to be a challenge. So let me give you some advanced preparation. My brother was in the military, so I know a little bit about it. You know, they don't just go, okay, we're going to go fight a battle today. No, they go out and scout, and they prepare, and they get all their equipment together, and they have a battle plan, and they do all this stuff. And so God is preparing them in various ways. So first, in chapter 1, he tells Joshua a very important thing. He tells him, before you get into the battle, I want you to focus on the law that's just been written. It's just been given to Joshua. So he's always got a spiritual kind of focus on it. Joshua 1:8, it says, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may have good success. And you might say, well, what's the law? I mean, the law doesn't tell them how to fight a battle or how to do anything like that. But we'll see, as the Israelites are spiritually successful, they have victory because God kind of provides it for them. But when they turn away from God, God stops being on their side, and it's going to lead to all kinds of problems in Joshua and in Judges. So he's telling them, don't forget about the law. Then he tells them, I want you to go out and spy on the land. Joshua comes up with this idea in chapter 2, and he says, I need to go scope out the battlefield, so to speak. Kind of similar to what Moses did 40 years ago when he sent the 12 spies in. But Joshua had learned from that, and so he goes, instead of sending 12 spies in and 10 of them coming back and being bad, I'm just going to send in 2 spies, because that's all that was successful last time anyway. So he sends in these 2 spies. Now, how they got inside the city, the text is not clear. Remember, they're Middle Eastern. They're not Canaanites, but they probably look somewhat similar to them. They're not. You may not have been able to pick them out of a crowd necessarily. So they're able to kind of sneak in. And Jericho's a pretty decent-sized town, so they could have said, "Oh yeah, we're from the next village over," or something like that. It wouldn't have been. It's not like there's 10 people in the town and they go, who's these 2 guys that we never seen before, kind of thing. It's big enough that they could have snuck in. But then they get into the town and they end up at this girl named Rahab's house. And think of it like this. Her dad is kind of like a hotel owner in the town, or an innkeeper kind of thing. And what he does is he takes all these foreigners in and lets them stay or in his inn, and then he kind of rents his daughter out as well. So she's called a prostitute in the text, but she's not really a prostitute in the way that, like, she's at some kind of prostitution house or something like that. She's being rented out by her own dad. So it's kind of this terrible story that you have in here. And so they're not doing anything improper. They're just at this inn talking to her, and then she tells them some important stuff. It said, where is it at? Here it is. Behold, they went out and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. So somebody rats them out. Somehow they figure it out, and King Jericho goes, let's find these two guys and kind of kill them or arrest them or do whatever. And so they start searching the whole town for him, which is, Jericho is not a huge city from what I understand, but it would take them a little bit of time to do this. So they end up going to Rahab's house, to her hotel, her inn, and Rahab tells the two spies, go up on the roof and I'll kind of cover you in some hay and do this. And so they go up on the roof, and these and the guards come and they say, hey, have you seen two guys? And she lies and says, oh no, I've never seen these two guys. I don't know what you're talking about. Now God's not telling her to lie. She does this on her own. She's still a pagan at this point. She hasn't converted to Judaism. So sometimes people say, oh, well, God told Rahab to lie. No, God didn't tell Rahab to lie. She did it on her own. But she does this, and God kind of uses it regardless. He would have protected them without her lying, but she doesn't know any better. She's grown up as a Canaanite. It says, but the woman had taken the two men and hid them, and she said, two men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. So she tells them this lie. And then she comes up in verse 8 to the two Israelites, and she says, I know that the Lord has given you the land. So she knows that the Israelite God has already promised them victory. She knows about this. Now remember, if they've been walking around for 40 years in the desert, the Canaanites are not just, oblivious. They're probably like, there's a whole lot of people out there in the desert that we keep seeing walking around doing nothing. What's going on with them? She says, I know the Lord has given you this land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before when you came out of Egypt, and that what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you, for the Lord your God, He is God. So she's saying, hey, I'm going to trust, your God is much better than any God we got. He dried up the Red Sea. We heard about the Red Sea. We've seen you guys in action doing all this great stuff. So she's basically like, I want to be on your side. Your God's better than my God. Your God is powerful and great. So then she says, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as if I had dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign. She asked God, she asked them, when you guys come and take the city, protect me and protect my family, basically. And that's where she puts the red cord down the river, down outside. And so then they go, okay, we'll protect you. Just have their little red string yarn, whatever it was. So I know which house not to go in and fight and stuff. And so they go back to Joshua, and they're like, we got this. They're scared of us. They know we've been coming for 40 years. They're not ready for this fight. So Joshua then decides, all right, we got to cross over the Jordan River, though. That's the problem. And in the picture here, you'll see the Israelites are over here. Jericho is right here. There's the Jordan River that goes all the way up here. This is the same Jordan River that Jesus gets baptized in and all that kind of stuff. They got to cross over the river. And the problem is the river's at flood stage, which means it's overrun. They can't just walk across it, and they can't ford it. It's too high. And so Joshua goes, well, God, how are we going to do this? We got a whole bunch of people here. How are we going to cross the river? And so God tells them, send the Ark of the Covenant first, step in the river, and I'll take care of the river. So God sends them. They go through that. The river parts. It's like their own version of the Red Sea for this next generation. It dries up. They walk across, and then and then when they leave, it starts flowing again. It's this miracle crossing. It's almost like the second generation's own version of the Red Sea. That, hey, God, our fathers got the Red Sea, we got the Jordan River kind of thing. So they camp at this place called Gilgal, which is right across from Jericho. And then they also have to do the circumcision because they didn't do it in the wilderness. And then finally this guy shows up. Joshua's kind of out thinking. He's a military guy. He's kind of the general. And he's looking up at this wall. And I'll show you some pictures of what Jericho would look like. It's like a fortress. This thing. We don't have it. It's a double wall system. What archaeology has shown us. He's like, we don't have any siege weapons. We don't have any of this stuff. We don't even have a real army. I mean, think about it. They've been in slavery for 400 years. They don't have a trained military force or anything like that. He's probably thinking, what in the world have I got myself into? And all of a sudden, this guy shows up next to him, and he didn't know what this guy is at first. It says, when Joshua was by Jericho, this is in chapter 5, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. All of a sudden he sees this guy. It doesn't look like anything. This looks like a normal guy. But he has a sword. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? He's like, are you an Israelite, or are you with the Jerichoites, or whatever they would have called themselves, the Canaanites? He's like, do I got to fight you, or are you on my side? What's going on here? And he says, no, I am the commander of the army of the Lord. I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? Now, if this is just an angel, then this is a problem, because the Bible specifically says that we're not to worship angels. Anytime someone tries to worship an angel in the Bible, the angel always goes, no, 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 don't worship me. So this seems to be like this is Jesus, or God incarnate, or however you want to say this is God. We would say this is Jesus. They didn't know exactly what that was in the Old Testament, but this would be a Christophany. This is Jesus in the pre-incarnation form. And he gives him the battle plan. And I don't know what Joshua thought about the battle plan. It doesn't tell us if he laughed or he's like, what in the world is this? But he says, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once, and do that for 6 days. And then the seventh day, you'll march around 7 times. So they're going to march around the city. I don't know if Joshua, it just says Joshua did this. I don't know if Joshua asked, okay, what's going to happen after we march around the 7th time, or if he just trusted God that much. But I would ask, God, is that all the plan you got? What about the walls? What about all this stuff? So Joshua does this. This is what the walls of Jericho, I don't know why that slides out there. This is what the walls of Jericho would look like. So this, I forgot, I'm in the camera view here. This would have been the first wall, and then there would have been like an embankment that they would have put probably like oil or pitch or something real slippery, and then there's a second wall behind it. So it's like if you get over the first wall, which would have been hard enough, then you got to try and climb up all this muck and stuff while people are shooting arrows and dumping stuff on you, and you got to get over the second wall. So Joshua probably, if you saw this, you'd have been like, man, how in the world are we going to take this? Well, what happens is, and this is what it looks like today, there's still remains of the wall at some of the, well, that's here's the wall. There's still pieces of it down there, and you can find, Dr. Price has some pieces over in the Bible Museum at Liberty that we saw when we went over there. And so what happens in the text is they walk around the city, and it's not, sometimes in the kids' movies, it's like all the walls just kind of like collapse out and the whole city's left out. That's probably not what happened. What probably happened is there's an earthquake of some type that puts a hole in the wall. God sends an earthquake, it destroys a piece of the wall falls down, and then they're able to get up into the city. They don't need to have all 4 of the walls go down, they just need to have enough of the wall to go down to get in the city. Also, if all 4 of the walls fell down like that, well, Rahab's family lives on the wall, so there's no way that she would have been able to survive if all the walls collapsed. So it's enough that they're able to do this, and God does that and destroys it for them. And so they're able to achieve this great victory. Rahab joins to the Israelites, ends up in the line of Christ, actually is a ancestor of Boaz, who we'll see in the book of Ruth, according to the New Testament. So she goes on that. So they have this great victory, and then they think, all right, we're doing really good. And then they have their first kind of setback. They get to this little town called Ai, or it's literally Ai. So I've heard it pronounced many different ways, but I just call it Ai. It may not be right, but it's like 3,000 people live in this town. And they're like, oh yeah, we can get this. We can defeat this town. We don't even have to break a sweat for this. So they send guys over and they lose the battle. They get destroyed. The army gets pushed back. And Joshua's in depression. He goes to God and he's like, God, what is going on? You told us you would protect us. And we just got beat by, like, you know, it'd be like if they were from Washington, D.C., they'd be like, we just got beat by Bedford, or, you know, some small little town or something like that, just defeated like the whole state of New York City or something like that. You'd be like, man, something weird happened. And God tells them, well, the problem is there's this guy named Achan who has sinned in the camp. They were supposed to destroy the whole city of Jericho and not touch anything. And Achan goes and gets some gold and some nice clothes, and he buries it under his tent. I don't know how far he buried it, but if it's gold, it probably didn't have to bury it too far, but it's heavy. But he buries it under his tent, and he's trying to hide it. And so God tells Joshua, you got to find this guy and get rid of him, basically, because they were under what's called a death pact. Everyone agreed before the invasion that we will do exactly what we're supposed to do, or we will be basically, you know, in our terms today, it would be like getting court-martialed or something like that in the military, and you could go to, you know, we would send them to prison. In their culture, they would have punishment, or they would have to die for it. And so they whittle it down. It's like it's like God's kind of tell Joshua, he goes, well, he's from this tribe, and then he's from this clan, and then they all have to walk past Joshua, and then he finally finds the right family, and then they finally finds Achan. And he goes to Achan and he goes, hey, Achan, did you take something you weren't supposed to? And he finally goes, oh, yeah, I did. So he gets killed. And then they go back up and fight the city again. And because God's with them this time, they destroy the whole city, have a great victory. And they continue on in the conquest. This is where Ai is probably today. It's just a little town kind of thing. Tel means like burial site, or not burial site, dig site. So they'll call it like Tel Dan is one thing. It just means kind of dig site. It's an archaeological term that they use. They don't call it, because a lot of times until they know for sure it's a place, they'll just call it a Tel something. Because they don't want people getting confused and thinking it's the right place. Because unfortunately, when they dig stuff up, a lot of times they don't. The first thing they dig up isn't the signpost from out of town that says, "This is the city of Ai," and they've been like, "Oh yeah, no, we know where we're at." Usually they dig and they find some guy's bathroom or something like that, and they're like, "Well, where is this from? We don't know." And they got to dig around and try to find stuff and do that. So, but then they basically have two campaigns. They have a southern campaign and a northern campaign. So think of it like the Civil War, where you had like Lee and Grant up in the north, and then Sherman and his guys were down in the south against Hood and all those other guys. There's two different, but it's the same army. They have two different campaigns. And so first they fight these guys. They're going to have to fight these guys named the Gibeonites. Now the Gibeonites come up with this trick. They go, well, we can't defeat the Israelites, but we know they're only driving out the people from far away. So they come to Joshua and they put on all these old clothes and they get all these old wine skins. They're all broken down, and it's like they go into no offense, Jerry, they went to Goodwill and found a bunch of old stuff and dress up and do this kind of stuff. And they go to Joshua and he goes, well, who are you people? And they're like, oh, we're from really far away and we're just visitors just like you. And Joshua doesn't pray or anything. He goes, okay, well, that's fine. We won't. God only told us to drive out the Canaanites. He didn't tell us specifically to drive out anybody else. So he's like, if you guys aren't Canaanites, you guys from far away, we'll make an alliance with you. Well, the next day they get up and they go to the next town and they meet the same people. It's like really far away. You're like a mile down the road or something like that. And to us it sounds weird because we'd be like, well, if they lied to him, you just say, well, you lied to me. I'm not going to follow through. But in the ancient world, if you gave your word, even if you're lying, if someone lied to you, you would hold it. And so Joshua was like, well, I can't kill you because I told you I wouldn't do that. So he basically puts them in charge of cutting all the wood and preparing the tabernacle. And eventually they kind of just meld into the Israelites and become part of the nation. And they're there for a number of years.
Daniel, is that 9 and 10? Is that the chapter?
Yeah.
Okay.
They defeat the Amorites. The Amorites decide finally, we can't. Well, this is not a very good battle plan. We can't. He's just kind of going through and picking off all these towns. He takes out Jericho, and he takes out Ai, and he takes out Gibeon, and finally some guys go, we got to make an alliance, guys. If we just let them pick off one town at a time, they're going to defeat us. So these 5 kings, ones that are from some pretty big towns. I mean, Jerusalem, Hebron's a big town, Lachish is a big town. They all get together and they go, let's make an alliance and gather all our forces and try to defeat the Israelites all at once. And so this is a story where Joshua decides, all right, this is a little tougher now. I'm not just fighting one city. And so he has to kind of fight a whole group of them. And this is kind of what it would look like maybe with all their kings are getting together and making this kind of pact or whatever. And so they get everyone together and Joshua has to fight this big battle. It's kind of like the big battle. Once they get this battle won, it's like the Gettysburg of the conquest. It's like once they win this battle, they kind of are able to finish off everybody else pretty quick. So they went fighting the battle, and they're trying to win, and they're running out of time in the battle. The sun's starting to go down. You don't fight in the dark normally in the ancient world because you can't see anything, and there's no electricity and that. And so Joshua goes, well, we're winning the battle, but if they get a chance to regroup tomorrow, they could probably defeat us. It'd be like, if you know anything about Gettysburg, the Confederates win the first day pretty much, and then the second day, then the third day, they lose, and they end up losing the whole battle. So you could lose a battle if you kind of lost the momentum or lost the advantage or whatever. So Joshua's like, God, we need a miracle here. We need you to somehow extend the battle somehow. And God tells him, don't worry, Joshua, I got this. And so this is the long day miracle that they had. It says in the chapter, let me read it over here. I'm going to flip over a little behind here. At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord and the day, and he said, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still. It's like Joshua's asking God, please make the sun stand still. And all of a sudden the sun stops. It's this miracle. Like, now how did this happen from a scientific standpoint? We got no, most people have no idea. Did God, because if you stop the earth from rotating, it's going to affect the gravity and it's going to affect all this other stuff. And people are going to, all of a sudden the tides are going to get messed up and all this kind of stuff. So people have speculated all kinds of different stuff. Some people think that maybe the rotation stopped that's possibly, but it would cause them. So they think maybe God just shed some light on them, kind of like the northern lights in Alaska, where the light refracts in a weird way, and it gets light like for like 18 hours in Alaska for a certain amount of time. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's just kind of divine light that He sent outside of the sun to make the day stand there long, or however it worked. We don't really know the exact details, but whatever happens, the day continues on, and it says that. And is this not written in the book of Jasher? Now, we don't have the book of Jasher. It's not in the Bible. Sometimes people ask, what's up with this book of Jasher? Well, this may have been a different book that just wasn't divinely inspired, that God didn't preserve and keep track of. Presumably, people wrote other things outside of the 66 books during the whole history of Israel, and then some of them weren't inspired and weren't covered, but Joshua was like, hey, if you don't believe me, it's in like the history book or whatever it is, whatever this book of Jasher is. So it says, the sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There had been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So Joshua returned, and all of Israel with him, to the camp, because they had this great victory in the battle. Now, one of the things that people thought, this comes up from time to time, somebody, I think it was back in the mid-70s or early 80s, made this claim that, NASA found, some scientist at NASA was doing some type of, I don't even know what it would be, study in the history of the earth or something, and he thought, I'm missing a day in my chronology, and some other guy who he knew was a Christian said, well, have you thought about the day that the sun stood still in the book of Joshua? And he read it, and he plugged it into his calculator or whatever, and it proved that the Bible was true. And so it ended up in, all these pastors repeated the story, church bulletins put it in, all this kind of stuff back in like the early 80s. The problem is, nobody knows who the guy was. There's no documentation of it. And scientifically, I don't think there's any way that you could actually figure that out from a historical. So it ends up in, even on the internet, and now it's probably on the internet someplace, and so I'm sure people can look it up on the internet and think, so it probably didn't happen. If it did happen, we don't know who came up with it, who the scientist was, anything like that. But so it's not necessarily a proof, but we have it in the Bible, so we don't really need a scientific proof necessarily. Then they conquer all these other places. Some of these places end up becoming very important. Lachish is one of the towns from where those 5 kings are from. Lachish becomes like the Fort Knox of Israel, so to speak. It becomes, or the West Point, or whatever you want to call it, it becomes the most fortified town in the country. And when they invade later in the book of Isaiah, they have to take out Lachish before they can get to Jerusalem. So they're able to conquer that. That's a pretty impressive victory. They destroy Hebron. That's where Abraham was from, in that region. So they're conquering there. They're taking Debir. They're taking all these towns. Altogether, they defeat 31 towns. But then they have the northern campaign. They kick the south. So it'd be like... They defeated, in World War II, they defeated the Germans, but they still had to fight the Japanese, until the war didn't just end when Hitler committed suicide. They still had to fight the Japanese. It's like that. They got the northern campaign. They defeat the south, then they got to go up to the north. And they try this attack again. They rally some guys together, and Joshua hears about this army that's coming down, that he thinks, there's no way I can take this army. It says, when Jabin, king of Hatzor is a major town up in the north that they have to defeat, heard of this, meaning the southern campaign, he's like, he's not a dummy. He knows, man, if this country, if these people have destroyed all these other people, they're going to come for me next. So he knows I got to do something here. He sent to Jobad, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country and in the Arab south. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde, a number like the sand that is on the seashore. That's a big army. If you can't even count it, I mean, because they count most. Joshua has about 40,000 troops, is how many men he has. So if they're even counting it, it's got to be more than 40,000 because they counted up 40,000. It's got to be this huge army that these guys gathered. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them and fell on them. It's like they're gathering all these troops at this place, and Joshua has this kind of like surprise attack and catches them off guard and destroys a lot of them and defeats most of them. But then it says, and the Lord gave them over into the hand of Israel, and chased them as far as the great Sidon, and they struck them until he left none remaining, or until he defeated the whole army. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said, and he turned back at that time and captured Hatzor. So he finally captures like the big city in the north, and all the cities of their kings and all their kings Joshua captured. So they found this great victory in the north, and they burned Hatzor to the ground because God commanded. There's only 3 cities they burned to the ground. They burned Jericho, they burned Ai, and they burned Hatzor. So one of the big questions in archaeology, and I don't want to get too deep into the archaeological weeds, is people say, well, the secular archaeologists say, well, we dug up everything in Israel, and we don't have any evidence of all these cities being destroyed and burnt. We only found a couple of cities that have ash. They can tell if the city's burnt because there's a whole layer of ash in the dust. And that was their big argument. Oh, you guys claim that the Israelites conquered and burned all these towns, but they didn't read the text. The text specifically says they only burnt Jerusalem and Ai and Hatzor. So it's like they're looking for all these cities that were burnt, and the Bible never said that they were burnt. So it's kind of like they were they didn't pay close enough attention to the text to do this. So they destroy this town. This is what Hatzor looks like. They actually found it. They dug it all up. And it's this kind of ancient city that they found to give credence to what the Bible talks about. So altogether, I think it lasts about 5 to 15 years. Sometimes people will say it's a little longer. But altogether, he defeats 31 kings and 31 cities. That's a lot of people that they have to defeat. This was not some sometimes we think, oh, they battled Jericho and they defeated Jericho and that was it. No, it's a long period. This is a drawn-out war that they have to fight. It'd be like, you came to America, you captured Atlanta, then you got to capture Charlotte, then you got to capture Washington, D.C., then you got to capture Baltimore, then you got to capture Columbus, then you got to finally get all the way over to California or something. He's got to go through all these different cities and capture all this. And that's why it takes so long. Then the second half of the book is actually, by the time you get to chapter 13, sometimes people think the whole book of Joshua is about the conquest. It's actually about half the book is about the conquest. The section starting in chapter 13, they start divvying out the land. It's like, okay, we got 12 tribes that we're going to receive land. The Levites don't get land. They are the priests, so they live in all 12 tribes. They're kind of like the pastors that live in each of the big cities or whatnot. And so they distribute all this land to that 2.5 of the tribes. They go, before the conquest, they make a deal with Moses and say, we kind of like it on the other side of the Jordan River. It's nice over here. Let's just stay here. And Moses says, you can have that, but you got to still fight with us. So then they move back over after the war. 9.5 tribes are on the West Bank, which is where all the, basically what Israel controls now. Israel doesn't really control the East Bank as much in modern day. That's where the nation of Jordan is today, basically. The Levites don't get any territory. And Shiloh, this place in verse 18, is set up as kind of their religious capital. That's where the tabernacle ends up. And so think of it, that's their, they don't own Jerusalem until David. David's the one that conquers Jerusalem, makes it the capital. So Shiloh is their religious and basically like the capital of the nation. So kind of like Philadelphia was the capital, and then when they made the new constitution and stuff, they ended up making it Washington, D.C. the new capital. So Shiloh is the capital. Caleb has the conquest in the book. Caleb's like this, at this point, Caleb's in his like 60s, 70s, 80 years old. We're not sure how old he is. He's like one tough old dude. At one point, he's like, I really like this town over here and up in the mountains. I think I'm going to capture that. Joshua, is it okay if I capture that? And Joshua's like, sure, do whatever you want. You're like the other faithful spy. You're kind of do. So he takes his couple guys with him, and they go and capture this whole town. And Caleb sets up shop there and makes that his place. And his descendant, Othniel, who we'll see in the book of Judges, is from the line of Caleb. He's the first judge. This is how it breaks out. You have all these different tribes. So Judah is down in the south. You have the tribe of Dan here on the coast. Dan will actually move in the book of Judges. We'll get to that. Benjamin is kind of a weak tribe. They're right in the middle of the country, which becomes important in the book of Judges. And then Ephraim's up here, Manasseh, all these other tribes up in the north. Dan eventually moves up here in Judges. We'll get to that. So when the nation splits after Solomon, it divides right along this kind of black line here in between Ephraim and Benjamin and Judah. So that's kind of where the corner is. But this is where all the nations are. Reuben's over here. Asher's up here. They all get a specific spot of land. And how it worked is God gave you, they would divide it up. All the tribes got X amount of land. So think of it like a state. So all the tribes get a spot of land. And then they divvied it up between all the families. It'd be like your family gets these 6 miles of land or whatever it was. And then you could sell your land, but you could only sell it within your family. You weren't allowed to sell your land to an outsider, because it was like God has given you this land as an inheritance, and you weren't allowed to just give it away. It was something that you had to stay within the family. And so that becomes an issue in the book of Ruth when we get to that she has to find someone that's related to her in order to buy the land back and whatnot. So they have all this land that God has given them. Then God sets up these things called cities of refuge. And we talked a little bit about this when we did the law section a couple of weeks ago. There were 6 cities that were set up: Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan, all spread out throughout the country. And basically what they would do is, this is where the judges would be. Think of it like this is where the court system set up. Remember, they don't have, this is 2,000, 3,000 years ago. They don't have a great legal system like we do today. So what would happen is, if you made a mistake, say you accidentally ran over your neighbors with a cart, something like what we would consider manslaughter today. You know, you got in a wreck or something and you accidentally killed somebody, but you didn't, it wasn't like murder where you went out and tried to do it. you would then run to one of these cities of refuge to then talk to the judge. Because otherwise, their family would try to get revenge on you and try to kill you. In the ancient, that's just how they did it in the ancient world. If you kill one of our people, we're going to kill one of your people. It's kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys or something like that in Kentucky. So they would run to one of these cities and they would go through the legal process. This is where the judges are and where the court systems are, in a sense. And God establishes all this so that they have some type of government in civil situations to do this, so that they're not all just kind of killing each other. They have these Levitical cities that are set up that the sons of Aaron end up becoming the high priest, at least for a while. And they have cities set up, so think of it like the religious centers of different areas where the priests would be. They're in all kinds of places, but think of it like this would be kind of like with a Vatican or something like that for the Catholics, where this is where the high priest is. Remember, they don't own Jerusalem yet, so they have to have different cities that are set up. Then at the end of the book, there's this weird story that we'll close out with here tonight, because we'll get to Judges next week. And I'll just reprint the notes with some different stuff. But the 2.5 tribes that are moving to the West Bank decide, all right, war's over, however long it took, 5 years, 15 years, however long that was. War's over, we're going home. And they get to the Jordan River, and they're like, wait a second, before we leave, we better do something, because our generation will remember we're Israelites too. We help people fight. We help them fight and take our land. But like, when we die off, and our children or our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren or whatever, later on, the Israelites on this side of the river may forget that we're Israelites as well. So they say, we gotta make some kind of statue or memorial so they can remember that we're part of this country as well. It'd be like if I don't know, Hawaii and Alaska built some kind of statue, say, hey, I know we're not connected over here, but we just want you to remember that we're states too, kind of thing, because you're not connected to us as much. And so they build this statue that they call an altar of testimony. But the other tribes get very confused, and they're building a statue, they're building an idol. So we got to go and destroy them. So they get their army up. They gathered all 10 armies, all 10 of the other tribes. They get their army, and they talk to Joshua, who's like probably like almost 100 years old at this point. And they go to Joshua, and Joshua's like, let's wait a second and talk this out, guys. Let's not go and destroy this. We just got the land. Let's not go and start a civil war now before we talk to them. So Joshua goes and talks to them, and they go, no, we're not building an altar. We're just kind of building a reminder stone to remind you guys that we're part of you as well. And so at the end, they have this piece, they call it an ed, a table of witness or a testimony, and they end up kind of breaking apart and saying, all right, we'll remember you guys and do this. Now the important thing is they talk this out and they don't have a civil war. When we get to the book of Judges, we'll see at the end of the book of Judges, they don't talk it out, they don't think this through, they're much less spiritually inclined, and there's a big civil war that breaks out, and they end up killing each other at the end of Judges. So we'll talk about that next week or 2 weeks from now, but that's where we'll end today. We got through Joshua. I thought I was going to do some part of Judges, but I forgot about the stuff in the beginning, so we'll pick up in Judges next week and then the following week, because Judges will take a while. Judges is a tough book to get through in one sitting, so there's a lot of... Judges is one of those books where it's like a lot of people are kind of familiar with some of the stories, like Samson and the first half of Gideon and stuff, but there's a lot of other stuff in Judges that people have never heard of in their life, so we'll get to that. No, I've never heard a sermon on the last 4 chapters of Judges, so we'll cover that next week or the following week. So, but we'll see what happens as far as we get next week. All right, let's close in prayer. God, we thank you for this day. God, we thank you that you are a God that is faithful to us, that you fulfill your promises. We see in the book of Joshua that you promised Abraham that they would control the land, and although it took a long time, 600 years, that you ultimately fulfilled your promise, and that gives us confidence that when you make promises to us, that you will be also fulfill your promises, and we thank you for that. Pray that as we continue through the study of the Old Testament, that we'll be able to take it and apply it to our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Mhm.